Hello, and welcome to this week's Ask an Atheist. My name is Liz Cavell, and I'm Associate Counsel for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It is 2024, and today we're going to talk about some of the latest in anti-LGBTQIA+ legislation, what we're watching for this year's legislative sessions in 2024. As always, if you have questions about this topic, you can drop them in the comments below, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. I am joined today by attorney Kat Grant. Hello, Kat.
Hello.
Who has a fellowship here at FFRF through Equal Justice Works. Kat works specifically on issues at the intersection of state-church separation and LGBTQIA issues in the law. And so we're here to talk about the 2024 legislative sessions, which many of you are aware it is only January 24th.
24 days into the new year, everybody.
The year just started. Kat, where are we at in state legislatures with anti-trans legislation?
So we are set to outpace the past 2 years. So I just checked right before coming up to the studio, and according to the spreadsheet that we use and a lot of other LGBT advocates use to track what's going on, we are at 301 anti-LGBT bills filed just in the past 24 days. This is just shy of the total of 315 bad bills filed in all of 2022, and well on track to beat last year's just over 500 plus bad bills. I should mention that a large amount of credit needs to go to Allison Chapman, Alejandra Caraballo, Aaron Reed, Evan Urquhart, Mira Lazine, and Van Jones, a team of freelance journalists, as well as Alejandra is a lawyer at the Harvard Cyber Law and Security Center, who maintain this spreadsheet of bills with risk analysis, which is truly a vital resource for everyone trying to fight this. We do our own legislative tracking as well, but the speed at which this is coming in, I was talking with our state policy manager, Ryan Dudley, just this morning about how, Arkansas's legislative session hasn't even started yet. So they truly are doing so much work to make sure that those of us who are trying to fight this are able to do our jobs.
Right. So many of these bills are being pre-filed or newly filed this year. Some states have legislative sessions that span 2 years, or have rules that bills from last year can roll over into this year. So these are bills that are actually going to be considered by state legislatures in 2024. More than 300 bills already so far. So
yes, and that's also including federal bills. We are also seeing a large uptick in federal bills, whereas last year we only saw a very small handful. I think there are around somewhere between 7 and 10 federal bills so far, which it's an election year. People want to put, hey, we fought against the trans on their campaign ads.
Right. That certainly explains, we see an uptick in message legislation. Always when it's an election year, this is a way that elected officials can be seen to be standing for some of the things that they want to electioneer on and that they want to run on when they're being often primaried or just trying to get reelected or elected to state or federal office. So we would expect more bills just in general in an election year, but this is really a staggering speed and coordinated effort in this one area of bills pertaining to trans people. When you think about, the share of the population that these bills pertain to, it is just staggering how many bills are being filed on these topics.
This is absolutely a coordinated effort. I've talked about it on other episodes of Ask an Atheist that I've been on, but there is significant evidence that this is a coordinated effort amongst Christian nationalist organizations. The Alliance Defending Freedom are good friends in every lawsuit at this point. The Heritage Foundation, Liberty Counsel, they are all coming together and writing this model legislation. And that's why if you look at a lot of this legislation in different states, you will see that it is essentially identical. The wording is always the same because these well-funded, supermanned groups are coming together as a singular force and writing this legislation and handing it off to state legislatures.
And we were talking just before air that we're seeing these same exact model bills on the same exact subject matter passing in one fell swoop per legislative year. So for example, in 2022, I believe it was 18 bills passed, the same bill passed in 18 states involving bans on trans youth in public school sports, which my policy friends tell me is unheard of in terms of one bill passing that many states in one legislative year. This is not just a coincidence and, great legislative minds are thinking alike.
Yeah.
It is a coordinated behind the scenes assault by interest groups. And usually they're groups like ADF that have explicit Christian nationalist, Christian dominionist mission.
Right. And this effort, well, it's really starting to snowball now, really dates back to around 2016, 2017. Madison Polly has a very good article about the coordinated effort that these organizations have engaged in order to ban gender-affirming care specifically. You can find that at Mother Jones. But this has been a coordinated effort for getting close to a decade now, if not longer. And I think it's also important to note that with this snowballing, it feels like trans issues are new. Trans people have not suddenly caused some major crisis in sports or healthcare or bathrooms. These are not like suddenly there has been an uptick of, sexual assault in bathrooms by trans people. Actually, the sexual assault in bathrooms myth has been debunked by sexual violence and domestic violence advocates for years, and that has been continued to be debunked. This is just trans people are the easy target right now. Not a lot of Americans know a trans person. And as these Christian nationalist groups have realized that they have lost the fight when it comes to same-sex marriage, although as we'll get into when we talk about a bill from my very own home state, they are prepping to take that fight back on. But as that has not been a popular fight, they have moved on to trans people to enforce strict, primarily religious understandings. And I know there are people who do not like when I say primarily religious understandings of gender and gender roles, but these are trying to enforce a visual performance of gender that is in line with Christian nationalist morality. That is their intent, even if there is a coincidental aligning with some people's views on gender that perhaps they have not deconstructed, and that is what I will say on the topic. This is a broader push to define masculinity and femininity in an anti-feminist, anti-gender equity, anti-gender equality way, to put women essentially back into their place, back into their proper sphere. So this is a much deeper and much more insidious issue, as we're going to get into.
Right. And don't take our word for it. You can listen to the actual legislators who propose these bills, name these bills, talk about the need for these bills in the legislative record when these bills are being debated ad nauseum. These proponents of this government action, they're telling us the purpose behind these bills and the motivation for their understanding of trans identity or their understanding of, gender and sexuality. They're naming their bills the Millstone Act. They're talking about, the evils of trans people and literally demonizing trans people. That means calling them demons.
Yes.
In the legislative history on these bills, and we're seeing the actual content of some of these bills. The purpose of them is to, some of them, there's a whole menu of anti-trans legislation to pick from, but of course a large portion of them focus on exemptions, denial of care and exemptions from treating trans people on equal terms with other people. And
exemptions for religious parents in the foster care context who
exactly
don't want to abide by the rules requiring them to accept and support a trans or, non-cis heterosexual child.
Exactly. And these denial of care and other exemption bills revolve around religious citizens being able to enforce their understanding and their beliefs about trans people and trans identity onto the rest of us. It's classic, religious, liberty wielding as a weapon to exclude other people from society in violation of laws that are meant to protect people on these protected bases. So it's not just us saying that these bills are a threat to true religious liberty and to secularism. It is the proponents of these bills, their backers, the organizations that spend all their time coordinating these efforts
and their
across
money.
States, and of course, their money. So, Kat, let's take one of our fun road trips across the country and get the survey of what's going on, what's teeing up for 2024. Where are we seeing some of these bills? Is there anywhere surprising? Probably some places unsurprising that are spending all their time attacking trans people.
Yeah, so for the most part, the worst states are the usual subjects. Florida specifically, since last summer, has been categorized as do not travel by journalist Aaron Reed. You can see there that image is courtesy of Aaron Reed. Again, fantastic advocate, fantastic journalist. So this is the risk assessment map specific for adults. So you can see there Florida is in black. That means do not travel. Obviously, the darker red, the worse the state. And then the darker blue, the better the state. I think probably the one that surprised me the most is New Hampshire, where they have had a few higher risk gender affirming care bans and sports and bathroom bans pop up. But you can see there in the light red. Here in our own state of Wisconsin, where we are based out of, you'll see that we are light blue. We have had quite a few anti-LGBT bills introduced, especially this session. We're watching very closely a gender-affirming care ban. Myself, Ryan Jane, and Ryan Dudley have been keeping a very close eye on this. We have written testimony, we have given verbal testimony, as we are just, a block away from the State House in Wisconsin. But for the most part, for adults, it's pretty much the standard subjects. I mean, Liz, are you seeing anything on this map that's surprising you?
No, other than Florida's not surprising. It's just interesting that how quickly Florida has accelerated itself. Like if you look at that as sort of a map of general conservativeness and general, liberalness, it's really surprising how accelerated the push in Florida has been towards all of these, really ultra religious right, conservative culture war issues, and to the point where it is the gangrenous toe on that map.
Yeah. So a lot of that has to do with the way that Florida has approached trans kids who are in perhaps situations with divorced parents where one parent is okay with gender affirming care, another parent is not. There's a lot of dicey. It is unclear right now whether or not the state can take kids away for getting gender affirming care. It is to the point that a lot of people I know who live in Florida, a lot of people I follow on social media have full left the state. I don't think we should underestimate the fact that we are in the midst of a trans refugee crisis. There is a significant portion of trans adults, including myself, who have left their home states because of anti-LGBT legislation being passed. And so Florida is really, we're watching Florida because they have gotten so out of control that is basically where Florida is, that's as bad as it's going to get in any other state until Florida moves further, which is, I think, for you as a native Floridian and for me as a native Hoosier, it's not a fun time.
It's not a fun time. Well, that map captures adult risk, and we would expect youth trans risk to track, pretty closely with that map. But I think it's important to talk about also the risk that so many of these bills are posing to youth. So let's talk about bills affecting trans youth.
Yes, so you can see there is a lot more dark red on this map when it comes to trans youth. So a lot of this is what we have been talking about in the year and a half since I have started at FFRF. It's a lot of gender-affirming care bans. It's a lot of sports and bathroom bans. We are also seeing a lot of forced outing and forced misgendering. So there are a lot of these bills that require school counselors, teachers, etc., to, if a child says, hey, I think I'm trans, hey, I think I'm gay, hey, I think I want to go by a different name or pronouns, would require parents to be notified, which can be incredibly dangerous as a blanket policy, because you do not know which parents are going to start abusing their kids. This is the type of legislation that will kill children. That is not hyperbole, because parental rejection is one of the highest indicators for suicide risk, mental health risks, like depression and anxiety. A lot of kids from those homes have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's an indicator for substance use issues, increased risk of STIs, increased risk of HIV and AIDS. It is truly a massively risky category of bill. And unfortunately, this type of bill is starting to appear also on the federal level. So we are seeing an increase of federal bills like the Empowering Parents Act, which would ban, amongst other things, it bans teaching kids about racial discrimination, teaching kids about radical gender theory, which literally just means trans people exist. That's chill. It's a sports and a bathroom ban. It's a ban on requiring masks in school without parental consent. It prohibits federal law enforcement from targeting a parent for exercising their First Amendment rights on school property or at school board meetings.
Oh my God.
They spend a couple more pages talking about CRT, forcing school employees to out queer youth. Also requires parental consent for a trans child to go by a different name or pronouns.
Wow.
This is all one bill.
That's a one-stop
This is one
shop.
federal bill.
You have to admire the efficiency of that bill.
Yeah, they were like, we're going to throw everything and the kitchen sink into this one bill. There was also a provision about not closing schools due to illness, aka we can't have COVID shutdowns anymore. So that's one federal bill. Moving back to adults very briefly, on the federal level, we also have the Safeguarding Honest Speech Act, which prohibits federal agencies and departments from directing employees not to misgender trans people that can risk federal funding. So that is also a new category. We are seeing this categorization of referring to trans people respectfully with the terms that we prefer and the terms that accurately describe our experience of ourselves in the world as dishonesty, which, it was not that long ago that you, me, and Patrick were sitting here talking about 303 Creative and the claim that same-sex marriages were dishonest, false marriages.
Yes.
So we're, seeing a bit of a pattern there. And really, I was talking to my dad about this last night. He categorizes it as the Safeguarding the Right to Bully Act.
Yes.
Because that's all it is it is the right to be disrespectful.
And let's sweep it all into speech, because we all know to revere speech. And to pick up the 303 Creative connection, I mean, literally, that was the essence of the argument, which is my belief is that these marriages are false. In other words, they're not real. And by, making a marital website or a wedding website for couples who have a relationship that I think is false, I'm being required to say false speech, right? It's like the same thing. It's like honesty in speech. We should all be free to speak our honest truth, except for you and,
Yes.
people like you.
And, This particular bill is focused on the federal level and on federal employers, people who receive federal funds, but I have full belief that we are going to see iterations of this where it will create a cause of action against private employers if they, say, hey, this is harassment. This is workplace harassment. Please do not make this other employee feel bad and unsafe and uncomfortable. And, if they get terminated for that, that will almost certainly start to give rise to a private cause of action there. And, it's just going to be this absolute waterfall of trans people do not get to be respected. Like,
right.
Everything else gets to be prioritized over a very basic, easy, and simple thing
right.
to do.
And I mean, we're putting it in the bucket of speech, but it's speech in the same way that it's like speech to refer to anybody by their name.
Yeah.
Their given name, their chosen name. It's like saying, I don't think you look like a William. I think you look like a Todd, and I'm going to call you Todd.
Refusing to use someone who changes their name when they get married.
Right.
Refusing to use that last name.
Yeah. I think that's patriarchal bullcrap. I'm going to keep calling you Miss Jones.
That's not the name on your original birth certificate, so I'm not going to call you by your name.
Yes, we are talking about speech, but we're also talking about respect, workplaces. In the federal context, right? What federal employers are trying to do is create welcoming and respectful work environments for everyone, not just some people, and especially not on the basis of their people's sex or gender identity or race or all of these other things that I think federal employers rightly should strive not to have discrimination in the workplace, especially on those bases. And so all that's being corrected on or restored by these federal bills is an employer's right. Or desire.
And it's also worth noting that at least right now, the law of the land, the Supreme Court has said that discriminating against trans people in the workplace is a Title VII discrimination.
Right.
We will see if that changes. But
right. And what's the big, semi-truck gaping hole in that is maybe unless the discrimination is based on the discriminator's religion.
Yes.
So just to bring it full circle.
Yes. So some other rising trends we're seeing, and for those of you familiar with the history of abortion restrictions, you will be like, oh, wait a minute, I'm hearing alarm bells. Bans on Medicaid funds and other public benefits being used for gender-affirming care. So for example, in West Virginia, there is a ban being considered on all adults on Medicaid and then any youth on Medicaid or CHIP, bans for New Hampshire youth on Medicaid. And then in South Carolina, we're looking at a ban for youth regardless of their insurance, and then for adults under the age of 26 who are on Medicaid. So as you can see, there's been all of this argument and all of these sayings like, we're just protecting kids, we're just protecting kids, we're just protecting kids. We're making sure that, they're fully developed and they can make these decisions and not regret them. But now we're seeing, but if you are a low-income adult, you do not get to have your health care covered because we don't want public money being spent on that, which, considering the state of wage stagnation and the state of the economy currently, that is a lot of Americans and an increasing number of Americans who will not be able to make the proper healthcare choices based on, these bans, which we saw with abortion has been one of the top tier ways that they have limited abortion access over the past several decades.
Right, exactly. And this is the playbook for, picking these cultural and oftentimes overlapping with fundamentalist Christian ideological beliefs, right? Life begins at conception, and just using every possible tool in the toolbox, federal funding, governmental access, exemptions under the law, all of these tools to make it so that, that belief is enforced through power of law and pushes these, cultural or, these cultural battles, wedges them into this like one particular group's theology and makes it inaccessible for the rest of us. And that's the playbook here, and we're seeing it at this rapid pace.
Yep. So another category that we're seeing is also just defining trans people out of the law completely. So there are a lot of bills that are, sort of as a reaction to Bostock, being like, no, sex for the purpose of discrimination is based on either they say your genitals at birth or your chromosomes at birth. I should note, anytime we talk about chromosomes, we need to recall that A, intersex people exist. There is actually a very strong variety of chromosomal diversity in Americans, or not in Americans, in humans. Americans are human, shockingly. It's roughly, I think it's roughly 1% of the human population is intersex. The comparison there, of course, is that if you know someone with red hair, you probably know someone who is intersex. But there's also the idea that, you can't make determinations based off of people's genitals. Like, sex and gender are two different things, and also people do get bottom surgery. So it's very hard to enforce, but that is what they are trying to define sex as. And so this comes in a few different ways. Some of it is defining for the purpose of sex discrimination. Some of it comes in, like in Florida, there is an upcoming ban being considered on gender markers, which would be the first in the country to require that the gender marker on a driver's license matches what your chromosomes are. Which, again,
one
very
wonders
few.
about enforceability.
Yeah, very few people get their chromosomes tested. Indiana also, in its defining sex and defining trans people out of the law bill, has a fun little section where it's a trigger for the overturning of Obergefell, which is the same-sex marriage case. So there is a section in that bill that is taking where a lot of state constitutions prior to Obergefell had explicitly defined marriage as being between one man and one woman. And that is a concern that certainly, as the court has indicated that they are willing to overturn Obergefell, has come up. But now Indiana, my home state, is trying to go one step further by saying it is between a biological man and a biological woman. So, a trans man married to a woman, that marriage would be considered invalid.
Illegal.
Yep.
This is going back to the bad old days of DOMA and all of the legislation like that was meant to do this exact thing to same-sex couples, which is define their relationships out of existence and make them illegal, and which is what supposedly Obergefell settled the question of. And of course, these states are emboldened by the radicalization of the federal courts and the Supreme Court, and there is hope there that Obergefell will be rolled back, invalidated, or in some way not extended or not understood by this current Supreme Court to protect trans people in their relationships.
Right. And so I believe this is the last category in my notes because I want to make sure that we have saved enough time for questions. But there is also this year a big uptick in online obscenity laws that they're very, very sneaky, and they're very, sneakily crafted, in that you look at them at first and you're seeing like, oh, it's restrictions on youth being able to see pornography, which already existed. It's restrictions on youth under the age of 13 being able to access via social media things like graphic depictions of suicide, graphic discussions of, mature mental health issues, things like that. But the way that these bills are being constructed is also meant to be interpreted as any depiction of a trans person, that's obscene. A minor in some of these bills, it's anyone under 18. In other cases, it is anyone under 13. Cannot see this. This also includes drag, because, and I think this is something that we don't talk about enough, but the proponents of these bills and the anti-trans contingent view trans bodies and trans existence, and by extension drag, because anyone can do drag regardless of gender or sexual orientation, but the proponents of these bills equate being trans with drag. Like, that is why I always put them in the same category as anti-trans bills, because even though not everyone who does drag is trans and not every trans person does drag, the proponents of the bills do not care about that distinction.
Yep.
They view all of that as inherently pornographic. You watching this right now, congratulations to the people who are writing these bills. You are watching pornography because there is a trans person on the screen existing. We are also seeing bills very similar being applied to the school context that would essentially force trans teachers out of the profession, because if we know we need anything in this country right now, it's less teachers. There's, not a critical shortage of teachers right now. That's not happening at all.
Right. Let's make it harder for our teachers to do their jobs and use their discretion. I mean, I thought about this when you were talking about the social worker, the forced outing bills and school social workers or school counselors. And all that's being done by these bills is forcing, making a one size fits all, and the size is anti-trans, for every single school counselor in every single school district in every single state across the country, instead of allowing school counselors and teachers and individual school administrators to make decisions about what's best for their students based on the circumstances that exist in the school, in the community, in the student's family. I mean, I don't understand why. I mean, we were talking about, like local control and throwing these controversial questions back to the states where they belong in the context of abortion and Dobbs. But we're taking power and discretion out of the hands of teachers, school counselors, administrators, when it comes to doing what's best for students, which, like it or not, includes trans students.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends that work in education, kind of the nature of having done marching band in college. I knew a lot of music education people. My best friend is a teacher. She's about to come back from Japan and start looking for jobs again, and she's looking in Indiana and in Texas. And she has outright said, I will not follow the law. If that means they take away my teaching license, fine. But until they take away my teaching license, I'm going to keep doing what is right for my trans, my non-binary, my gay, my bisexual, my pansexual students, because that is the right thing to do, is to act with discretion and prioritize the safety of these kids. And that is the responsibility of any teacher.
And sometimes what's in the best interests and the safest course for kids will involve cooperation and communication with parents and caregivers,
right,
and sometimes not.
Right. So still around, of course, we should not forget that the gender-affirming care bans are still around. We're running out of states that are viable for gender-affirming care bans, especially for minors. But even in those states where they have already passed, I think we're going to start see them edge up into adults. We're also starting to see requirements for what is called gender exploratory therapy, which sounds like it would be a great thing. Very cleverly named. There's a lot of clever naming, and I emphasized this in my most recent blog, that the people who do this, they're not stupid. They are immoral, but they are not stupid, and we should not equate the two things.
Yeah, gender exploratory therapy is one of those things that sounds really fun and is actually a giant bummer.
It is actually conversion therapy. So it is a requirement that before you even fathom that you might be trans, you explore every possible other reason why you might be experiencing gender dysphoria or think you are trans. You have to find every reason why you're not trans. It is therapists convincing people that they are not trans. So we've also got bathroom bans still going in schools, but we're also expanding to other public restrooms, including a particularly horrific bill in Utah that applies to any public restroom or locker room that if you are someone whose genitals do not match the locker room or bathroom you are in a public setting, and it is specifically genitals because they say the genitals you are born with, or if you have had bottom surgery. So you know what? In a weird way, I kind of give them credit for at least addressing that enforcement issue. But you can be charged with up to 6 months in jail for trespassing if you have the incorrect genitals, which means, and this is bad for cis people as well as trans people, it will require law enforcement to perform genital inspections. And there are probably people sitting there saying, well, only trans people are going to deal with that, and I'm not trans, so I don't care. But I'll take back to the point I brought up earlier, where I was discussing these ideas about the performance of gender and gender roles. There are many women who do not perform to a particular standard of femininity. There are many men who do not perform to a particular standard of masculinity, like regardless of their actual gender identity. So, you know, say you are in an airport bathroom and, you know, you're wearing sweatpants, you know, you're a woman, you're wearing sweatpants. It's the airport. No one's trying to look good in the airport. If you are, I'm confused. But, you know, and someone goes to security and says, well, I think this person who is not wearing makeup and, you know, is wearing kind of shapeless clothing, I think that person is not a woman. This person does not have a vagina. And so security's going to come in there and
what?
Ask to see your genitals. Even if you are a cis woman.
Or could under the law. Like,
yes.
This is not like people like spin casting. This is what's written in the bill.
Yes.
I mean, presumably these are bills that are enforceable and will be enforced by law enforcement. And what will trigger these like enforcement procedures, i.e. in genital inspections, is anybody's guess. I mean, you have to infer from the language of the bill that that would be the course of action taken
right.
if someone's accused of trespassing in a bathroom that they shouldn't be in.
And what that leads to is, you know, anytime you get dressed and go out in public, you are going to think about stereotypical gender presentation. You know, Liz, you have a wonderful pants ensemble going on today.
Thank you.
But what happens when someone who decides that pants should not be worn by women points to a law enforcement officer and says, that person is not a woman?
Right.
What
I mean,
are you
it's like
doing in the aftermath of
we're
that?
literally just talking about gender presentation, and it's of course affects many cis people, even ones that are pretty traditionally feminine or masculine.
Exactly.
I mean, have I had a pixie haircut? Yes, I have. Was it great? Debatable. You know, I've been known to wear a baseball cap, no makeup, and some ratty sweats to the airport in pixie hair. I'm not about to open my genitals up for inspection to any law enforcement officer. I don't like that bill.
Exactly. So
am I a trans person? No.
Yeah.
Is that a terrible bill in a secular democracy? Yes.
Yes. It is so beyond regressive. And we're talking about women a lot because ultimately people forget that trans men exist and trans masculine people exist. You know,
right.
All of these like bathroom bans are always about, well, men in the women's restroom. But, you know, there's also trans masculine people who are in the men's restroom. But no one's ever worried about that. And this has actually come up in discussions about these bills because they end up, a lot of times these bills only cover women's facilities and never discuss men's facilities. And then it becomes a constitutional issue of
right.
sex discrimination. Because it's like, wait a minute, one rule only applies applies to one bathroom. So there's just so much that goes into all of this, including ultimately misogyny and patriarchy. And this is the fundamental goal of all of these Christian fundamentalist organizations, is to require that women dress a certain way, look a certain way, behave a certain way.
Yeah. Amen. Well, and also, you know, like, oh, we should get to questions. What I was going to say, what I was just going to get into, like, we don't necessarily have to like go down this road, but I do think it's important to note that like, these are not these are not bills, you know, 300 plus bills that have already been filed in the 2024 legislative session, and they're solving zero problems.
Right.
Like, these are not, like, there's not data or even anecdotal evidence showing that like this is a social problem needing to be solved. Like, this is literally just a story that politicians are telling people about a vulnerable group of people for the purpose of like Christian nationalist fascist goals. I mean,
Yes.
it's not like we're talking about legislation that is like tackling a thorny issue and you might come down on either. It's like these bills do not apply to
Real life problems.
Right. So there's also like what's not being done by state legislatures across the country at the cost of these bills that are solving zero problems and that are actually really harmful.
You know, I would love more trains. I would love if our state legislatures would focus more on trains. You know, Madison needs an Amtrak stop, and instead we're yelling about gender-affirming care and the 6 athletes in the state that are trans.
And let's pass a law about what bathroom people can use. It's infuriating. Okay, I have some questions already from Facebook, so we're going to go to that because we always get a lot of questions on these episodes, and I think it's good. Okay, so here's one. I don't know the answer to this, but maybe you do, Kat. What does the Bible say about trans people?
Nothing.
Okay, well, that was easy. I actively and proudly refuse to learn more about the Bible than I had to learn in Catholic school.
So, see, I am genuinely fascinated by theology and gender. I'm actually listening to a book about the gender of God right now just because I'm fascinated by conceptions of God and gender. But in the Bible, the thing you have to understand, and this is the thing I bring up with Christians in my life, in my family, I have a lot of very progressive pastor friends who are in my life who have helped direct my conversations and help me try to do this advocacy, because I am very much an advocate for we have to work with religious people. We can't just say all religious people are bad, so we have to find ways to talk about it. And, you know, the Bible never mentions trans people because conceptions of gender are different in the Bible. We view the Bible now through a very modern lens and understanding. But, you know, verses about men wearing women's clothing being an abomination is about deception. It's not about gender presentation. It's also worth noting that in the classical world, the gender binary was not as it exists today. There were recognitions of non-binary people. You know, ancient Judaism recognized 6 genders. So it's so much more complicated, and you cannot read the Bible at face value of a translation, because English translations are a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. You have to understand it in its proper historical and literary context. So the answer is the Bible says nothing about trans people.
Right. Nor could it. Okay. Well, we covered this, but I'll just scream it out there. Don't trans people also have freedom of speech?
You'd think.
Presumably, if we're talking about the types of legislation that targets or, you know, pulls out speech and free speech claims as, you know, the tool for enforcing, you know, anti-trans behavior or, you know, erasing trans people, we're talking about a lot of times, sometimes like denial of care type legislation that has in its core like a speech angle, right? Like you have the right as a, I don't know, doctor or pharmacist or therapist to refuse to engage in speech.
Right. Ironically, the law behind that, they're called the Church Amendments, and they're not named for religious institutions. It just so happens that the legislator who it's named after, his last name was Church.
Love when that happens.
But yeah, I think this is going to come up a lot. We're seeing it in the drag context the most right now.
Right.
Where, you know, we just had West Texas A&M. I helped write our amicus brief on that, where, you know, we saw President Wendler censor a drag fundraiser, and the student group is now suing and saying, wait a minute, that is unconstitutional restrictions of speech.
Right. West Texas A&M is a state institution.
Yeah.
And the president of that institution is acting on behalf of a public university and is censoring speech in refusing to allow a student drag performance to take place.
Right. And I think that also applies to trans people existing in public. You know, my gender identity is not ultimately tied to how I physically express myself. You know, I'm non-binary no matter what I wear, but physical expression and gender identity are inherently tied. How do you censor what I can and cannot wear in a public restroom, especially if there is not a, you know, all-gender single-stall restroom available, which is what I go for when I can. But how do you censor what somebody wears? How do you censor, you know, what a child wears to school? You know, there's so much censorship involved. And I think we are starting to see the kind of pushback of, oh, wait a minute, this is expressive activity. This is speech. We have to balance it. The problem is that, as we have historically seen with the courts, no rights matter more than the rights of certain religious people.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So this is a question that I think is important and we haven't touched on because of all the bad legislation, but are there any good bills that are supporting the trans community, and or are there any legislators that have shown interest in authoring bills that counter some of these anti-trans bills or that enact protections for trans people?
Yes. So as we saw on the maps, all of those blue spaces, those are spaces where good bills are being introduced, especially the dark blue states. You can see, especially on the West Coast, Illinois, Minnesota. You know, Minnesota, for example, has recently instituted protections that are trans refuge protections that say, hey, if you are someone who has fled to Minnesota, say you are a parent of a trans kid, your ex wants to send them to conversion therapy, you want to get them gender affirming care, and you're the one with full custody. If you flee to Minnesota, we will not, you know, work with the other state to remove your child. You know, we also see this as we're starting to see aid and abetting clauses. Again, abortion comparison. There are also clauses in gender affirming care bans criminalizing aiding and abetting, taking someone across state lines to get gender affirming care in these dark blue states. You are saying we will not extradite someone for that. So you are seeing that there are people fighting over and over, and even in these dark red states, you know, we have friend of FFRF Megan Hunt in Nebraska fighting truly the good fight every single day for trans Nebraskans. You see in every single state, there are people fighting for queer people. There are people fighting for the rights of marginalized communities. There are people fighting for the rights of atheists. This is a topic I'm very passionate about because we write off red states. We do not give our support to the people fighting the fight in these conservative states. We have declared them a lost cause. And, you know, I'm from one of the statistically most conservative counties in Indiana, and I know good people there. I know queer people there. I know people of color who are fighting and fighting and fighting, and we cannot abandon those people. So you see those scary maps, and you see, oh, well, you know, these are the bad states. And it's, no, these are the states with the bad actors in power.
Right.
And we need to come together to support the good actors in those states, as well as to applaud the good actors in those dark blue states as well.
Right. Well, we're getting late, so I'll just ask one more question. We do have a lot of questions, which is great. But on the riff that you just ended on, what are some ways to advocate for trans youth who are in these sorts of hostile places and situations?
First and foremost, be loud. You would not believe, even in situations where you might not be able to run for Congress and change everything all at once, the trans kids in your community are going to see that. The trans kids who have to be in the closet because of their parents are going to see that there are other adults in the world that accept them and love them for who they are. So being loud and being verbal, being engaged, especially at the local level, does a lot. A lot of these decisions are being made at the school board level, at the library board level, at the county and city levels. You know, go to those meetings. You would not believe, especially in smaller rural areas, how empty a school board meeting can get. Don't let the bad voices dominate the conversation, because I think this is something that has always been a problem in this kind of activism, is we are always reacting. Mm-hmm. We are reacting. We let the conversation be defined by groups like ADF.
Yeah.
So I think being loud, always important. It's an election year. Vote.
Yes.
I know it is so easy to fall into voter apathy. I am fighting with it myself. But, you know, decisions are made by those who show up. So show up. You know, vote. Find out who the good candidates in your areas are. Donate, volunteer. Talk to other people about them. A lot of times, you know, I worked in rural political organizing. People don't even know that there's a candidate other than the incumbent that's been there for truly since, as my dad would call it, since dirt was white, before dirt even got dirty. You know, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends. If you have the time, the money, the inclination, run for office. You can be in the room. You can be the one standing up and saying, this is not what my state is meant to represent. This is not what my community is meant to represent. You know, you don't have to raise the millions of dollars to run for Congress. Run for your school board. Run for your library board. That makes a massive difference. And those races are often very uncontested. So getting out there and doing even just the little things, put up a pride flag, you know, those are the things you can do to help the young people in your community. Everything from tiny acts of resistance to running for Congress makes massive differences. We're not alone in this fight. None of us are. We all have something we can do. This is not... I joke that it's the doomscape, but it is not the end of the world. The fight is not over. It has only started.
That's right. That is a great note to end on. Kat, thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you, everyone, tuning in on this important topic and listening to us. That concludes Ask an Atheist for this week. But don't forget, we also have a weekly broadcast TV show. It's Free Thought Matters. And this week, Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker have a conversation with Zeke Heistrup, the director of a very interesting new film called Satan's Guide to the Bible. Here's a preview.
Israelites never entered the promised land. They are from the promised land. So even though there may have been some escaped slaves who were part of the early Israelite settlements, they wouldn't have made up a significant percentage at all. That these are Canaanites writing their own backstory the same way everybody else is, trying to make their people, their heroes, look better than yours. Everybody's borrowing ideas from each other. Everybody's making up their own backstories. And the backstory of being slaves in Egypt, escaping, wandering in the forest, entering the promised land, none of that happened.
You can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the U.S. and also on FFRF's Facebook and YouTube channels.
And don't miss Free Thought Radio. This week, the show features atheist chaplain Devin Moss, who was recently featured in a New York Times article. You can find the show at ffrf.org/radio.
And check out the latest episode of our We Dissent podcast. Our newest episode drops today, last week. And it's our New Year's mailbag episode. Listen as me and Rebecca Markert answer listener questions about religious liberty and so much more. Subscribe to We Dissent everywhere you listen to podcasts or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you are a member already, thank you. If not, please join. See you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.